The call on Independence Day, the air in Delhi shimmered with restless excitement. It was August 15th, Independence Day, and the Red Fort stood proud as thousands gathered, their hearts swelling with pride, their voices merging in chants of unity. The saffron, white and green of the Indian flag waved in every direction, each fold catching the morning light, each ripple carrying the weight of a nation's journey. The crowd buzzed with energy, but within that energy, there was also curiosity, an unspoken anticipation that something unusual was about to happen. People had come expecting the Prime Minister's speech, the tradition, the celebration of freedom, but they did not know they were about to witness a story that would ripple through every home in India, a story that would soon travel far beyond the walls of the Red Fort. As the Prime Minister Narendra Modi stepped onto the stage, silence fell across the ground. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, full of expectation, every ear straining to catch his first words. He began with the familiar tone of pride and reflection, speaking about sacrifice, progress, and dreams for the nation. The audience listened, some nodding, some wiping tears, some raising their phones to record. Yet amid this grand moment, something stirred in the Prime Minister's voice, a shift so slight that only the most attentive noticed it. His words slowed, his tone deepened, and then he paused longer than usual. Everyone looked up, waiting, and then it happened. With a gesture that was as unexpected as it was deliberate, Modi turned to the side and spoke into the microphone with a firm, almost personal weight. "Sundar Pichai, please come on stage." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. People gasped, some whispering to each other in disbelief, some clapping instinctively without even knowing why. The cameras swung wildly, searching, and finally they caught him. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, a man who had quietly grown from a middle-class boy in Chennai into one of the most powerful technology leaders in the world. He had come to watch, to blend into the celebration as just another son of India, but now every eye turned to him. His face, calm yet uncertain, appeared on the giant screens. The applause grew louder, the chants turned into cheers, and as he rose from his seat and walked toward the stage, the sound became thunderous. For Sundar, each step toward the stage felt heavier than the last. His mind raced. He was not a politician, not a performer, not someone used to standing before an entire nation. He was a builder, a thinker, a quiet force who believed in ideas more than speeches. Yet here he was, being called by the leader of the nation on a day that held the deepest meaning for every Indian. As he climbed the steps, his heart pounded. Memories flooded him. The cramped two-room house in Chennai where his family once lived, the times when electricity would cut off without warning, the evenings spent studying by the light of a single lamp, the pride in his father's eyes when he got admission into Itkaragpur. Those memories were alive now, as real as the roar of the crowd. Sundar kept walking, his humble posture almost in contrast to the storm of cheers around him. When he reached the stage, Modi extended his hand. Sundar took it, his grip respectful, his eyes lowered slightly in humility. The cameras flashed furiously, capturing the handshake that would soon appear in every newspaper, every television channel, every phone screen. The Prime Minister smiled and spoke into the microphone. "Today, on this sacred day of independence, we are reminded of the power of dreams. We are reminded of how an ordinary child from India can rise to lead the future of the digital world. Sundar, your journey is not just your own. It is India's journey. Will you share a few words with the nation?" The question hit Sundar like a wave. He had not prepared for this. He had no speech written, no notes hidden in his pocket. All he had was his truth, his journey, his memories, and for a moment he felt fear, not of speaking, but of failing to honor the moment. What could he possibly say that would matter to millions of hearts waiting in silence? He stepped to the microphone. The sound of his breath echoed faintly through the speakers. He looked at the faces in front of him, rows and rows of citizens, young and old, rich and poor, hopeful and weary. He saw children waving flags with innocent pride, veterans sitting tall in their uniforms, women standing shoulder to shoulder with men, all bound by the invisible thread of belonging. He took a deep breath, and in that breath, he found his anchor. "My name is Sundar," he began softly, his voice carrying both shyness and strength. "I was born in a small home in Chennai. My father worked hard to give us a chance. My mother sacrificed every comfort so we could study. When I first touched a computer, I did not know it would change my life. I only knew that if I kept learning, if I kept believing, then maybe one day I could do something meaningful." His words were simple, but they pierced through the air, like arrows of truth. People leaned forward, listening not just with their ears, but with their hearts. He continued, sharing how he struggled with self-doubt, how he often felt invisible in classrooms filled with brilliance, how he kept going despite failures, how kindness from strangers and teachers had lifted him when he felt low. He spoke of resilience, of humility, of the belief that respect was not about power, but about listening to others. His words painted not just his story, but the story of every child who had ever dreamed in silence, every parent who had sacrificed without asking for credit, every student who had faced rejection but tried again. The crowd was silent, almost reverent, as if each word was being etched into their memories. But then, just as Sundar was about to continue, a sudden sound cracked through the air. Sharp, loud, unexpected. The crowd gasped, heads turned, whispers spread in panic. Sundar froze, his breath caught in his throat. Modi's security rushed, to the edge of the stage, eyes scanning, bodies tense. The noise echoed again, and for a moment nobody knew what it was. The festive air turned electric with fear. Sundar gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles white, his heart racing faster than ever before. Something was happening, something that could turn this moment of pride into something unthinkable. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as the Independence Day stage became the center of a storm no one had foreseen. And then, just as Sundar turned his head toward the sound, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. Not literally, but in the weight of what was about to come. The story of his life had brought him here, but the story of a nation was about to test him in a way he never imagined. The sound that broke the silence, the sharp crack, echoed through the air again, and for a moment it felt as if time itself had fractured. The crowd that had moments earlier been cheering now froze in a collective gasp. Eyes darted, hearts pounded, and thousands of voices collapsed into an uneasy silence. Security guards rushed into position, their movements quick and tense, forming a protective shield around the Prime Minister. Sundar stood motionless at the microphone, his mind split between fear and responsibility, his body trembling but his feet rooted to the ground. In that suspended moment, he felt the eyes of an entire nation upon him, not just as an observer of history, but as someone suddenly thrust into its very center. The noise repeated, a metallic clash this time, distant but unnerving. Some in the EI crowd ducked instinctively. Others shouted in panic, but then, as the chaos threatened to take over, it became clear that the sound had not been a weapon. It was a flagpole crashing to the ground, the iron base striking the stone floor. The wind had torn it loose, sending it tumbling violently. What had seemed like danger was, in fact, an accident. Yet the fear it had ignited lingered in the air, thick and unshakable. People exhaled in relief, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. Something had shifted. In that fragile pause, Sundar looked out at the crowd and saw not just celebration, but vulnerability. He realized how quickly joy could turn to fear, how easily unity could be tested. Modi signaled the guards to stand down. The Prime Minister turned to Sundar, his expression steady, almost encouraging, as if silently asking him to continue. Sundar took a breath, and the microphone trembled in his hand. He had the choice to step back, to let the moment pass, to protect himself from the weight of it all. But deep inside, a voice reminded him of why he had come, why his life had taken him from the narrow lanes of Chennai to this stage. It was not just about technology, not just about leadership. It was about resilience, about speaking when silence was easier, about giving hope when fear was near. So he spoke again. "What just happened reminds me," Sundar said, his voice steady now, "that life is fragile. Fear can arrive without warning just as easily as opportunity. But in moments like this, what matters most is how we choose to respond. Do we let fear silence us? Or do we stand together, stronger than before? His words carried a calm strength, and slowly the unease in the crowd began to settle. People straightened. Children who had clutched their parents' hands now relaxed their grips, and the applause returned. Not thunderous this time, but steady, almost reverent. Yet even as the atmosphere calmed, Sundar's mind drifted inward, pulled back into the corridors of his own memory. Standing on that stage, he remembered being a boy of 12, waiting outside a post office in Chennai with his father. They had traveled for hours under the scorching sun to pick up a letter that had arrived from a distant relative. His father had held the envelope as though it were treasure, explaining to Sundar how important communication was, how the world could change when voices reached across distances. Sundar had stared at the envelope, fascinated, never knowing that one day he would lead a company that connected billions of voices across the planet. And now, here he was, being asked to connect with the heart of a nation, not through wires and screens, but through truth. He leaned closer to the microphone. I stand here not as someone special, but as someone ordinary who was lifted by the sacrifices of others. My mother cooked meals on a small stove every day, never complaining, never asking for more. My father saved every rupee he could, sometimes skipping his own needs so I could study. I was never the loudest in my class, never the one people noticed first. I was quiet, often shy, often unsure. But what I learned is that resilience is not about being fearless. It is about being kind to yourself even when you are afraid, and kind to others even when they do not see your struggle. The crowd listened intently, the earlier panic fading into deep silence. In the front rows, a young boy lifted his chin, his eyes wide with admiration, while an elderly man nodded slowly, his weathered face reflecting recognition of sacrifices long past. Sundar's story did not feel distant. It felt personal, like a mirror held up to the countless invisible journeys of ordinary Indians. Then, just as the atmosphere began to find its rhythm again, Sundar paused. He had felt something, an instinct, a shift in the air. At the edge of the crowd, a commotion was growing. It was not loud enough yet to cause alarm, but it was visible, a ripple of movement pushing against the sea of stillness. Sundar's eyes caught it and his chest tightened. Was it another accident like the fallen flagpole, or was this something more? Modi's security noticed it too, their eyes narrowing, their radios crackling with urgent whispers. Sundar felt a shiver run through him. He had not come to Delhi expecting to stand on this stage, let alone in the middle of tension that could shatter the day. Yet here he was, his own emotions battling between fear and the sense that he could must not step away. The people had looked to him once already, and now they would do so again. The commotion grew louder, shouts, hurried steps, the sound of something being pushed through the crowd. Sundar glanced at Modi, who remained steady, his face unreadable, but firm, his posture unbroken. The Prime Minister did not flinch, and that steadiness gave Sundar strength. But strength alone was not enough. Sundar knew something. This moment was not about him, not about power or fame or even technology. It was about leadership in its purest form, the kind that comes not from titles, but from humanity, from the willingness to stand firm when everything tells you to run. The noise reached closer. The crowd was no longer calm, their cheers replaced by whispers of fear, questions without answers. Sundar took a step back from the microphone, his thoughts racing. He remembered once asking his father, long ago, what true courage meant. His father had smiled and said, "True courage is not when you fight for yourself. It is when you stay for others." Those words burned in his mind now, alive as though spoken just moments ago. He turned back toward the microphone, gripping it tightly. His lips parted, but before he could speak, the sound that reached him this time was unmistakable. It was not a flagpole, not a commotion, not an accident. It was something else, something that carried the weight of threat, something that made the crowd erupt in cries of shock. Sundar's heart skipped. The stage trembled under the pressure of unfolding chaos. And in that instant, as fear and uncertainty surged back like a wave, he realized that everything was about to change. The breaking point, the cries of shock rippled outward like a storm spreading across a calm sea. People in the back rows strained to see what was happening at the edge of the crowd, while those in front instinctively pushed backward, creating a wave of movement that unsettled everyone around them. Sundar stood frozen at the microphone, his breath shallow, his heart thundering in his chest. This was no ordinary disturbance. The sound that had cracked through the tense silence was unmistakable. It was the clatter of something metallic, something dangerous, and the way the crowd responded left no room for doubt. Fear had returned, and this time it carried a heavier weight. Security forces surged toward the noise, their boots striking against the stone ground with sharp finality. Radios buzzed with overlapping voices, coded commands exchanged in haste. Some officers spread out across the perimeter of the stage, while others rushed into the swelling crowd. From where Sundar stood, the details were blurred, but he could see enough. The sudden scuffle of bodies, the raised arms of people trying to shield themselves, and the unmistakable look of panic in countless eyes. Sundar's throat felt dry, but even in that moment of terror, he remembered his father's words echoing in his mind. Courage is staying for others. He wanted to retreat, to step back behind the safety of the guards, but his feet refused to move. Instead, he tightened his grip on the microphone and forced himself to breathe. He realized that the people were not just looking to the Prime Minister for reassurance. They were looking at him too. He had been called onto that stage, placed before them not by choice but by fate. And in their eyes, he was no longer just a man from Chennai who built technology. He was a symbol of possibility. And symbols could not falter in the moment when fear threatened to consume hope. As the chaos continued, his mind wandered back to a memory buried deep in his past, a moment that had shaped his understanding of fear. He had been 16, walking home late from school through the narrow streets of his neighborhood. The power had gone out, as it often did, and the only light came from distant candles flickering in windows. On that night, he had been cornered by older boys, their voices sharp, their demands cruel. He remembered the terror that had clenched his chest, the helplessness that made his knees shake, but he also remembered the neighbor who had stepped out from her doorway, a woman with no weapon and no power, only courage. She had shouted at the boys, her voice steady, and they had fled into the darkness. Sundar had carried that image with him his whole life, the idea that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is a quiet defiance, an act of presence in the face of fear. He thought of that woman now as he faced the crowd. His voice trembled at first, but he forced it to rise, above the panic. "Please stay calm," he said, his words amplified by the speakers. "You are safe. The guards are here. We are together." It was not a grand speech, not poetic, not crafted for history, but it was human. And sometimes, human words were the ones that mattered most. The crowd quieted slightly, though unease still rippled through their bodies. Sundar could see children clinging to parents, young men shielding their sisters, elders struggling to hold their ground. He wished he could step into the crowd himself, reassure each person individually, tell them that they were not alone. But he was bound to the stage, bound to the microphone, and so he poured his heart into every word he spoke. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, a figure broke free from the commotion at the edge of the crowd. The guards reacted instantly, surrounding the person with precision. From the stage, Sundar could see only glimpses, the dark hair, the frantic gestures, the face streaked with sweat. The figure was shouting, not in anger but in desperation. And though the words were lost in the noise, Sundar could sense something different in their tone. This was not the rage of someone trying to disrupt Independence Day. This was the cry of someone who had been unheard for too long. Modi leaned toward one of his guards, his expression grave, but then he did something unexpected. He raised his hand, signaling for restraint. The guards hesitated but obeyed, pulling back slightly, while keeping a watchful distance. The figure, still breathless and trembling, was allowed a moment to stand. Sundar watched, his curiosity and fear colliding inside him. Who was this person? And what truth carried enough force to break into a celebration of independence? The Prime Minister glanced at Sundar, his eyes heavy with meaning, as if asking him silently whether he would step forward once again. Sundar felt the weight of that look. It was not a command, not an order. It was an invitation to rise, to hold steady, in the storm. And so Sundar did what his younger self would never have imagined possible. He stepped away from the microphone, walked toward the edge of the stage, and looked directly at the stranger in the crowd. Their eyes met, and in that instant Sundar saw not an intruder, not a threat, but a face lined with pain. The kind of pain, born not from malice but from years of being unseen. The stranger's voice finally carried clearly to the stage. You speak of dreams, but what about those of us who have none left? What about the people forgotten? The words pierced through Sundar's chest, heavy and raw, impossible to ignore. And before he could answer, the stranger collapsed to their knees, their bodies shaking with sobs that silenced even the loudest whispers in the crowd. Sundar's breath caught. The celebration of independence had transformed into something far deeper, far more dangerous, and far more human. And he knew, with a chill that reached his very core, that what came next would test not only his courage, but the very meaning of freedom itself. The voice of the forgotten. The stranger knelt on the ground, their sobs raw and unfiltered, cutting through the crowd with more force than any speech ever could. The sound was not theatrical, not staged. It was the cry of a wound that had been carried too long in silence. For a moment, the stage, the guards, even the Prime Minister himself faded into the background. All eyes, including Sundar's, were drawn to this single human being whose pain had brought thousands to stillness. Sundar felt his throat tighten. The instinct of the guards was to act, to remove the figure, to protect the sanctity of the day's celebration. But Sundar knew instinctively that this was not a disruption to be silenced. It was a truth that had forced its way onto the stage of history. He took a step forward, then another, his body trembling, his heart pounding, yet his eyes fixed on the stranger. Modi's gaze followed him, and for the first time, Sundar sensed that the Prime Minister was not just allowing him to step forward but watching closely, as if testing the strength of a man who represented not politics, not power, but possibility. When Sundar spoke, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. Please, tell us. What is it you want us to hear? The stranger lifted their head. Their face was streaked with tears, their hair damp with sweat, their eyes carrying the weight of years that seemed older than their body. Silence hung heavy as they struggled to form words. The crowd leaned in unconsciously, drawn not by curiosity but by the deep pull of empathy. My name is Arjun, the voice finally emerged, cracked but resolute. I come from a village you have never heard of. We are farmers. We live in the shadows of promises made and broken. My father worked the land until his hands bled. My mother carried burdens no one saw. When the rains failed, the debts grew, and when the debts grew, hope died. Last year, I buried my father beneath the soil. He could no longer feed. I watched my mother break, my brothers leave, and today, while the nation celebrates freedom, I stand here with none. Because what is freedom if it does not reach the forgotten? The words spread across the red fort like a storm. People shifted uncomfortably, some wiping tears, others looking away. The celebration had been meant for pride, for unity, for joy. But Arjun's voice dragged into the open, a reality that many wanted to keep hidden in the quiet corners of rural India. It was not treason. It was truth. Sundar's chest burned with emotion. He had never lived Arjun's life, but he had witnessed glimpses of it. He remembered visiting relatives in small towns where children studied under dim bulbs, where families rationed food, where survival was not about ambition but about endurance. He remembered how his own father had once sat him down, telling him that every step he took in education was not just for himself, but for those who could not walk that path. And here was Arjun, kneeling before him, demanding not charity, not pity, but recognition. Modi stepped forward now, his expression unreadable, his silence deliberate. The Prime Minister's presence loomed, but it was Sundar the crowd watched. Perhaps because Sundar was not a politician, not someone they expected to speak of such things. He was like them, ordinary once, extraordinary by journey, but still, carrying the humility of where he came from. Sundar knelt down, lowering himself to Arjun's level. The act itself sent a ripple through the crowd. The CEO of one of the world's most powerful companies, a man whose decisions affected billions, now kneeled on the ground in front of a farmer's son. Cameras clicked, flashes exploded, but Sundar's mind was elsewhere. He looked directly into Arjun's tear-streaked face and said, "You are not forgotten. Your father's struggle is not invisible. Your pain is real, and it matters. I cannot erase it. I cannot promise what I do not control, but I can listen, and I will." Arjun's shoulders shook, not from weakness but from the release of carrying too much for too long. Sundar's words did not solve the hunger, the debts, the despair, but they pierced through the wall of silence that had imprisoned him. And sometimes being heard is the first step toward healing. The crowd began to murmur. Some applauded, some cried, some remained tense, unsure what to make of this sudden collision between celebration and truth. But no one could deny the power of what they had witnessed. The moment when the glamour of Independence Day gave way to the raw honesty of human suffering. Then, as Sundar helped Arjun to his feet, another sound broke the air. Not the crash of a flagpole, not the clatter of metal, but the roar of voices rising from the crowd. Chants erupted, some shouting for justice, others calling for unity, all blending into a wave of noise that shook the very walls of the fort. The guards grew tense again, their hands twitching toward their radios. But Modi raised his hand once, more commanding calm. His eyes flickered toward Sundar, a silent acknowledgement that the story unfolding was no longer in his control. It was bigger than speeches, bigger than politics, bigger even than leadership. It was the voice of the people, awakened by the courage of one man's pain and another man's humility. Sundar looked out at the crowd, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew this was no ending. This was the beginning of something more. He had spoken of resilience and kindness, but now he had been shown what those words truly demanded. They demanded action, not just words. They demanded listening, not just speaking. And as the chants grew louder, as the atmosphere turned electric once more, Sundar realized the truth that chilled him. The nation had not just come to hear the Prime Minister that day. They had come unknowingly to test Sundar Pichai himself. And the test was far from over, because somewhere in that restless sea of voices, another presence was waiting, someone who had come not to cry for help, but to challenge everything Sundar thought he knew. The shadow in the crowd. The chants shook the red fort like a living heartbeat, surging louder and louder until they became impossible to ignore. The air itself seemed to tremble, heavy with the collision of pride, pain, and defiance. Sundar stood at the edge of the stage, Arjun beside him, the Prime Minister watching silently from a step behind. The guards tightened their perimeter, but their eyes darted nervously across the restless crowd. Even in the celebration of independence, there was now something volatile, something fragile, an electricity that could either unite or unravel in a single moment. And then it happened. From within the sea of voices, a figure rose above the chaos, not through volume but through sheer presence. Tall, thin, with sharp features and piercing eyes, the man pushed forward, his steps deliberate, his gaze fixed directly on the stage. Unlike Arjun, his expression carried no desperation, no plea for recognition. His face was carved with anger, his voice cut like a blade. "Words," he shouted, his tone dripping with disdain. "Always words, promises, sympathy, speeches, but tell me, how long will this nation survive on words?" The crowd fell silent in an instant, as though every ear had been seized. The man's voice was not just loud, it was commanding, filled with a kind of conviction that could sway hearts or ignite fury. He did not tremble like Arjun had, nor did he kneel. He stood tall, unflinching, his body radiating the certainty of someone who believed he had come to deliver truth, no matter the cost. Sundar's chest tightened. This was not the voice of the forgotten. It was the voice of the disillusioned, the voice of someone who had grown weary of hope itself. The man's eyes locked on him, unblinking, unrelenting. "You speak of kindness," the man continued, his voice booming across the courtyard. "You speak of resilience, of dreams, of sacrifice. But what do your words mean to the child who has not eaten in 2 days? To the worker who sleeps on concrete after 12 hours of labor? To the student who watches doors close before they ever open? You stand here as a symbol of success, but symbols cannot feed the hungry. Symbols cannot heal the broken. What good is your humility when the system remains cruel?" The words landed heavy, not just on Sundar but on everyone listening. People shifted uneasily, their earlier chants dying in their throats. Some nodded in grim agreement, others frowned, uncomfortable with the bitterness of the man's truth. Sundar himself felt the sting of it, because beneath the anger, beneath the accusation, there was a reality he could not deny. His mind raced. He thought of his own childhood, how he had once stood in long queues with his father, waiting for ration supplies. He thought of classmates who had dropped out of school not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked opportunity. He thought of friends who had brilliance in their eyes, but no path to show it to the world. Yes, he had risen, but how many had been left behind? How many still lived in the shadows, invisible even on the day of independence? Modi's security prepared to intervene, but once again the Prime Minister raised his hand, signaling restraint. His gaze flickered to Sundar, calm but unyielding, silently urging him to answer. Not with defense, not with denial, but with something greater. Sundar's legs felt heavy as stone, but he forced himself to take a step forward. The weight of the man's words pressed down on him, threatening to crush the careful balance of humility and hope he had carried until now. He gripped the microphone, and his voice, though quiet at first, carried through the silence. "You are right," he said, the words falling like unexpected rain. "My success does not fill empty stomachs. My story does not erase the suffering of millions. And yes, words alone cannot heal wounds that have been ignored for generations. But I stand here not to claim that I have all the answers. I stand here to say that even those of us who leave, who walk different paths, still carry India in our hearts. And if my voice can shine even the smallest light into the darkest corners, then it is my duty to use it, not as a shield, but as a torch." The man narrowed his eyes, unmoved. "And what will you do when the torch burns out?" Sundar hesitated. He had no rehearsed reply, no grand solution. All he had was truth, fragile and imperfect. He took another breath, steadying himself. "Then, I will keep walking with those who can light it again. Because resilience is not one person's strength, it is the strength we build together." For a moment, silence held. The crowd seemed suspended between agreement and doubt, between hope and despair. The man's lips curled into a half-smile, not of joy, but of challenge. He raised his arm, pointing directly at Sundar. "Words again," he said, his tone sharp as steel. "But let us see if you still believe them when the test comes. Because the test will come. Not tomorrow, not next year. Today. Right here." A murmur spread through the crowd. The tension was no longer just emotional. It had turned dangerous, unpredictable. The man's eyes burned with intensity, his voice rising to a pitch that rattled even the most stoic faces in the audience. And then, as if on cue, a group of figures emerged from the edges of the gathering, their movements coordinated, their expressions hard. The guards reacted instantly, tightening formation. But the presence of these new figures sent a shiver through the crowd. This was no longer just a speech, no longer just a clash of words. This was something bigger, something darker, something that threatened to turn Independence Day into a memory marked not by unity, but by fracture. Sundar's pulse quickened. Arjun stood beside him, trembling, torn between fear and the weight of his own courage. The Prime Minister remained calm, but his silence was heavy, his stillness deliberate, as though he knew this moment would decide more than just the fate of a ceremony. It would decide the fate of hope itself. Sundar tightened, his grip on the microphone, his breath shallow but his heart blazing. He knew he had been pulled into something far beyond what he had prepared for. And as the shadow of this new presence spread across the red fort, he realized that he stood on the edge of a choice that could either ignite unity or plunge the day into chaos, and the choice had to be made now. The final test, the courtyard, of the Red Fort was no longer just a place of celebration. It had transformed into a stage where history itself was being rewritten in real time. The chants had turned to whispers, the applause had faded into silence, and the air felt thick with dread. Sundar stood at the microphone, sweat beading on his forehead, as the group of figures moved closer through the restless crowd. Their faces were stern, their steps deliberate, their presence unsettling. No one knew what they wanted, but everyone could feel the threat hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The Prime Minister's guards tightened their formation, but Modi, calm as ever, did not give the order to intervene. His eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene, as though he understood that this was not a conflict to be solved by force. This was something deeper, something that required words to cut sharper than weapons, humility to weigh heavier than anger. The leader of the group stepped forward, his eyes locked on Sundar. Unlike Arjun's raw grief or the second man's bitter challenge, this presence carried a cold clarity, as though he had rehearsed this moment for years. His voice rang out across the courtyard, steady and sharp. You speak of resilience, of kindness, of dreams. But what do you truly know of sacrifice? What do you know of those who give everything, not for success, not for glory, but for survival? Today, Sundar Pichai, you stand before a nation as a symbol. But we are here to strip symbols away. We want truth, not stories. We want change, not comfort. The words struck like blows, and the crowd shifted uneasily once more. Sundar felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. He thought of his parents who had sacrificed silently. He thought of Arjun, whose father's life had ended beneath the crushing burden of debt. He thought of the countless unseen millions, who had no voice, no stage, no chance to tell their stories. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to speak, his voice quiet but resolute. You are right again, he said. My story alone cannot answer the hunger of the poor, the despair of the forgotten, the pain of the broken. I am not here to stand above anyone. I am here to kneel beside them. If I am a symbol, let it be a reminder that dreams are possible, but also that dreams demand responsibility. Responsibility to act, responsibility to listen, responsibility to never forget where we came from. The leader's eyes narrowed, unimpressed. Responsibility means nothing without action. Will you stand here and speak, then return to your world of glass towers and endless wealth, leaving us to carry our burdens alone? The question struck Sundar deeply. His silence stretched, and in that silence the crowd seemed to lean forward, waiting. The guards shifted uneasily. Arjun trembled at his side, his face still streaked with tears. Modi remained perfectly still, his hands folded, his gaze locked on Sundar. It was as if everyone had conspired to leave the choice entirely in his hands. And then Sundar did something that stunned everyone. He stepped away from the microphone. He walked to the front edge of the stage and sat down. Not in the posture of a leader, not in the stance of a man above the crowd, but as an equal among equals. The cameras flashed wildly, but Sundar ignored them. He placed the microphone aside, his voice now carried only by the strength of his presence. I cannot promise everything, he said, his words raw and unpolished. I cannot erase the failures of generations, but I will not walk away. Not today, not tomorrow. If change is to come, then let it begin not with power, but with humility. Let it begin with me listening to you. Let it begin with me carrying your voices to every table where decisions are made. He turned toward the leader, his gaze steady, his voice unshaken. You say symbols mean nothing, then let me show you I am not a symbol. I am a son of this soil, like you. And if you will not believe my words, then test my actions. Walk with me, challenge me, hold me accountable. But do not let despair win, because if despair wins, then the sacrifices of those before us are wasted, and I cannot allow that. The leader's expression flickered, just for a moment. It was not surrender, not agreement, but something softer than anger. Recognition. The silence stretched again, but this time it was not heavy with dread. It was alive with possibility. Arjun stepped forward, his voice trembling but determined. He listened to me. No one else ever did. That is more than I had yesterday. Maybe that is how it starts. The crowd began to stir. The whispers turned into murmurs, the murmurs into chants. Softer at first, then swelling louder and louder. But this time the chants were not divided, not chaotic. They carried unity, not fracture. Voices rose together, calling not for fear, not for anger, but for hope. The leader of the group lowered his gaze, then slowly stepped back. The figures behind him followed, retreating into the sea of people. The threat that had loomed like a storm began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile but undeniable light. Sundar felt tears sting his eyes, though he blinked them back. He looked out at the crowd, at the children, the elders, the farmers, the workers, the students, the dreamers, and saw not despair but strength. Fragile, imperfect, but alive. The Prime Minister finally stepped forward, placing his hand on Sundar's shoulder. His voice carried warmth and gravity as he spoke into the microphone. Today, we were reminded of what independence truly means. It is not only about the freedom we won in the past, but about the freedom we must keep building. Freedom from fear, from hunger, from silence. Sundar Pichai reminded us that humility and courage walk together. Let us not forget what we witnessed. Here, the applause that followed was not thunderous like before. It was steadier, deeper, carrying the weight of something real. It was the sound of a nation not just celebrating but awakening. Sundar stood quietly, his hands folded, his heart heavy yet hopeful. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy. He knew the accusations, the challenges, the despair would not vanish overnight. But he also knew that something had shifted, something small but unstoppable. And as the tricolor fluttered against the sky, as the sun glinted off the ancient walls of the red fort, Sundar whispered silently to himself, "This is only the beginning." The crowd roared again, voices rising, in unity, and for the first time in his life, Sundar felt not just like a leader, not just like a CEO, but like a son of India standing shoulder to shoulder with his people. And in that moment, he understood that independence was not a story of the past, it was a promise still being written.